My name is Scott Stroud, a faculty member in the Department of Communication Studies. I've long been interested in the relationship between philosophy and rhetoric, and one of the figures that has intrigued me the most has been the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant. Now, when people say Kant and rhetoric, everyone generally asks for the discussion to stop because they say, the story is set. Kant hated rhetoric, and that's simply the end of the story. But what I have been looking at in my recent research has been the idea that Kant had a very complex notion of rhetoric, and that rhetoric served an important role in Kant's aesthetic theory, as well as his moral philosophy. In the next few minutes, I want to tell you some of the general contours that lie around anyone's attempt to try to tell a story of Kant and a useful notion of rhetoric in his philosophy. Now, the first hurdle to get over, of course, is why do we have this overall impression that Kant hated rhetoric? Well, part of the story relates to a fellow philosopher in Prussia at the time, Christian Garve, one of the popular philosophers who wanted to enlighten the Prussian masses through the curated presentation of exemplar texts like Cicero and Aristotle. Garve, in other words, was very rhetorical. He wanted to take the right example, present them with the right framing, and then a popular, widespread audience will be enlightened without using much in-depth argumentation. Now, this use of example has a long history in the sophistic tradition. So Garve is merely continuing an idea of example and declamation that figures like Quintilian or Cicero or Protagoras or Gorgias even used to train orators in the very artful practice of using persuasion that fits the moment. Another problem, of course, is that Garve's moral intuitions and moral philosophy was very much opposed to what Kant would find as acceptable, especially in his later thought. Garve loved ideals, some coming from Cicero, such as honor and happiness. And these are some things that strain the relationship between Kant and Garve. So in many cases, when you read Kant opining about a very negative notion of rhetoric or even example, think in the background, part of the meaning of these terms has to be the contrasting figure of Garve. So after you look at this story of what Kant says, and even if you understand Garve as kind of the foil to many of these things, you may simply want to say, well, Kant obviously hated rhetoric. And he pitted it against all that was good in his own philosophy. Now, is this all we can hope for in reconciling philosophy and rhetoric for Kant? Now let's go back to ground zero of this story, the spot where everyone who wants to talk about rhetoric and Kant starts, the Critique of the Power of Judgment from 1790. Now in this volume, the Academy Edition, volume 5, right around page 321, you get some of Kant's very important utterances about rhetoric. So for instance, on 321, he talks about the arts of speech, and he labels them as poetry and rhetoric. On that page, he also talks about rhetoric as the art of conducting a business of the understanding as a free play of the imagination. Poetry, that of carrying out a free play of the imagination as a business of the understanding. A few pages later, another spot in the third critique, Kant talks about rhetoric insofar as by that is understood the art of persuasion, for example, of deceiving by means of beautiful illusion as an ars oratoria, and not merely skill in speaking, eloquence and style, is a dialectic which borrows from the art of poetry only as much as is necessary to win over minds to the advantage of the speaker before they can judge and to rob them of their freedom. Thus, it cannot be recommended either for the courtroom or the pulpit. On the next page, in a footnote where he actually references Cicero and some of the Roman rhetorical tradition, he talks about eloquence and well-spokenness, together rhetoric, belong to beautiful art. But the art of the orator, as the art of using the weakness of people for one's own purposes, however well-intentioned or even really good these may be, is not worthy of any respect at all. So once we turn to the Critique of Judgment, it's very tempting to say that, well, it's obvious as day. Kant hated rhetoric. It used people as machines, and this was something that was antithetical to his moral philosophy and his very moralized aesthetic theory. But if we start looking closely at those key passages, especially attending to the German terms that lie behind the various English translations, we start to get a more difficult story to unravel. So for instance, on page 327 of the third critique, you see the idea that Beredsamkeit, which can be translated as rhetoric or eloquence, is equal to this phrase, die Kunst zu überreden, the art of persuasion. And you also see how bloße Vorredenheit, skill in speaking is one of the ways to translate that, is composed of two subcategories, effectively eloquence and style. So you start to get these kind of conceptual distinctions being made for positive and negative underneath these kinds of terms. And if you look at that footnote on 328, you start to see how the art of the orator, Rednerkunst, is equivalent to ars oratoria. And this is contrasted to rhetoric, translated as rhetoric, which is composed of Bredheit, eloquence, and Vorredenheit, well-spokenness. So you start to see how the story gets more complex if you have the imaginative charity to say Kant didn't think of rhetoric as one thing, and that one thing maybe wasn't wholly bad. So there's a large constellation of terms that starts to appear that can be loosely or closely connected to what we mean by rhetoric or the art of persuasion in Kant. Some are positive, some are negative, some are very neutral. So the first conclusion that I'd like to impress upon you is the idea that rhetoric, as ambiguous and flexible as that term is not one thing, either for us, for the tradition, or for Kant, nor is it one practice. It is or involves a complex set of communicative practices and potentialities, skills, and capacities. Now, what are some of the values of these different aspects or different practices of communication, persuasion, or rhetoric? So let's get into my reading of Kant and Rhetoric. Of course, other scholars will disagree, but I mean, the point is we need to have some imagination and put these texts together in a way that's useful and leads to new stories instead of just closing down stories about Kant and Rhetoric. First, we must remember, however, before we even get into the idea of rhetoric, the image of freedom and community that Kant generally assumes is ideal. It is simply put that one's freedom as a rational agent is compatible with and must be compatible with the agency of every other agent. So in Kant's moral philosophy, in the 1785 groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, you get this progression of moral laws or formulations of moral laws, from the one concerning the formula of universal law to the formula of kingdom of ends to the formula of humanity as an end in itself. And all of these show the idea that human society needs to be structured in such a way that it preserves and promotes human autonomy and human willing. The way we orient ourselves towards our actions and our goals needs to also enshrine that kind of concern with how our freedom gets along with the freedom of others, our autonomy, really, in the sense of the kingdom of ends formulation. So Kant obviously is going to be against things that truncate that sense of autonomy and that sense of dignity that comes along with it. We must also remember that Kant is realistic. Human society will require skills such as persuasion. For instance, if we look at the 1803 edition of his Lectures on Pedagogy, you see Kant resolve the concept of Bildung into a tiered process of discipline, instruction, and moralization. The second stage, instruction, or pragmatic formation, as he puts it elsewhere, involves communicative skills. As Kant says, quote, "In the instruction of children, one must seek gradually to combine knowledge and ability. Furthermore, knowledge and speech must be combined, eloquence, fluency, ease in talking." So you see that Kant appreciates and includes the skills that would connect with persuasion and eloquence. The final stage, moralization, involves the acquisition of, quote, "the disposition to choose nothing but good ends. Good ends are those which are necessarily approved by everyone and which can be simultaneously ends of everyone." So in other words, we see the position emerging. Communication and persuasion and the skills of communication and persuasion matter, but they must be tempered by and guided by the moral ideals resident in Kant's particular way of looking at freedom and its connection to the moral process. So we get to what I think is a very profitable way of cashing out rhetoric in Kant. I think there are generally two kinds of notions of all those terms, the constellation of communication, speech, and rhetoric. All these terms can be kind of loosely oriented in two large categories. First is the notion of manipulative rhetoric, or the idea of practices of communication that typically harms the autonomy of audience members in service of ends held by the speaker. The second would be non-manipulative, or what I call educative rhetoric, extending along the lines of Plato in the Phaedrus or the Gorgias, where rhetoric improves those whom you speak to. This is communication for Kant that preserves and promotes the autonomy of speaker and audience. Now, the question immediately arises, what are the characteristics of manipulative rhetoric. And I think you see these in those passages that I just quoted from the third critique, and you also see them in other places in his lectures, for instance, on anthropology. But loosely, they could be put as three characteristics for manipulative rhetoric. First, manipulative rhetoric tends to involve an inequality of knowledge between the speaker and auditor. I know something about what I believe or about what sources of evidence I have or don't have that you hearing my message perhaps do not have access to. Second, the sort of rhetoric, manipulative rhetoric, exerts a causal force on its listener. It short circuits their ability to rationally agree to what is said in the same way that I, the speaker, agrees to or disagrees with what was said. Instead, this rhetoric, the use of language, merely pushes my audience or tricks them, presses buttons, uses them as mere machines, as Kant says in various places. Third, another hallmark of this sort of rhetoric would be the idiosyncrasy of its goals. This is not as evident from the passage as the other two features, but it is there. When one resorts to trickery, it's only through keeping private one's own goals in the interaction. That's how my trick or my scam or my manipulation of the other person actually works. Now, what are the characteristics of the other side of the rhetorical coin? Those practices we can loosely group as educative or helpful rhetoric. If you look again at the Critique of Judgment, page 327, that passage, you see a list of about four characteristics for this good practice of rhetoric or communication. First, it will draw upon domain-specific knowledge and content in the construction of appeals. Many ideas, usually negative on Kant and rhetoric, kind of picture Kant as thinking ideal communication is just talking with ideas of pure reason, your head in the clouds. But none of us speak in the ideals or ideas of pure reason. We talk about specific things, about specific cases in court, about specific educational content matter, etc., specific policy matters. So Kant is enough of a realist that I don't think he's going to say any talk of domain-specific areas is bad. On the other hand, he'd say the best sorts of eloquence will be ones that are intimately acquainted with the subject matter of which they speak. Second, educative rhetoric will utilize vivid means of presentation in attempting to move one's audience towards belief. So again, not manipulative means, but vivid means, means that place the audience in an experience. In the rhetorical tradition, this is known as enargeia, a term that has a long tradition dating back to the ancient Greek sophists, the idea of making present the case or the instance or the action that you speak of to some audience, perhaps jurors in Greece or Rome. For Kant, he talks about this term as hypotyposis, a term that comes again in his aesthetics, comes again in his religion. The idea that certain ways of speaking or certain ways of myth-making, for instance, in religion, can make concepts real to us. Aesthetic experience, to some extent, does this with the experience of freedom. The third characteristic of educative rhetoric would be that it does not violate euphony or propriety. Basically, the kind of notion that your speech respects others and how it affects them or how it offends them or doesn't offend them. So in other words, in speaking about the domain-specific matters to other people, do we respect those other people in the way we speak about this? For instance, in his anthropology lectures, he talks of illusions that enhance autonomy of others. So for instance, the illusion of respect to people that you may not totally respect is one way that we could decrease our own pulls of self-love and increase the social distance between us and these other people, and maybe even get other people to be respected in our own eyes. So illusion is kind of a implored trick on ourselves. So propriety in rhetoric can be another way of saying this. Showing some amount of civility, some amount of respect to those we talk to is one way of instantiating the kind of respect for others that the formula of humanity as an end in itself might demand of us. Also, if you think about stil, you look at his Dreams of a Spirit Seer, where Kant lambasts Swedenborg in an anonymously published text. And he also attacks the metaphysicians of his day that look just like Swedenborg. Now, one thing that I see is going on in this very trenchant early critique of Kant's is that he's not just upset at the claims of spiritualism or spiritualists like Swedenborg, he's concerned with the rhetorical style that Swedenborg uses in such works as his Arcana. The idea of not referring to a world that the speaker and listener have equal access to, not using reasons that are publicly available to the audience, not respecting the audience member in the rhetorical utterances. All of these things were violated by Swedenborg for Kant. Swedenborg for Kant simply said, "Trust me, I have seen, I have heard, this is the truth." And the fourth characteristic of educative rhetoric is a commitment to persuasion using public resources, so related to this critique of Swedenborg, that are known and shared by all participants. These are what Darwall considers as second personal reasons. So the idea is that a reason I give you should also be a reason that I take for believing in that which I speak of. Now, there's much more to this story, and I want to just end on a couple summative notes. I've written a book a few years ago that goes into these in much more detail, but if you want to think about educative rhetoric and specifically how it plays out in Kant's very rich critical philosophy, we can think of it in about three domains. The first domain would be pedagogical educative rhetoric. Another domain, the second domain, would be religious educative rhetoric. And the third domain would be critical educative rhetoric. So let's talk briefly about each of these. Pedagogical educative rhetoric would be the sort of rhetoric that's implied or overtly discussed when Kant talks about the things that help educate us into better moral reasoners. So for instance, in the second critique, Kant talks about the Anne Boleyn example, a very stipulated hypothetical version of this example, as being very useful in moral education. And he's not just talking about children here. He's talking about getting people that have the basics of rational judgment into ascending states of mind that move them away from idiosyncratic, inclination-based incentives up to larger motives that we would consider in line with the moral motivations of the moral law. So this would be one example of how examples could be used to get an agent to feel their freedom, to see the potentialities of their agency, and to hopefully do it and motivate them to do it in the next instance. Religious educative rhetoric is another fascinating domain. Kant's religious thought deserves a lot more work than we've given it, but in a lot of his religious work, he's talking about communicative means and practices that are useful to reform our dispositions or group dispositions, such that we solve the social problems that Kant talks of in his religion within the bounds of mere reasons. So for instance, in his religious texts, I see two sorts of rhetorical or communicative means. First are discursive means, using language. These can involve sermons from religious leaders that motivate us or instill a certain state of mind in us. They could be narratives in religious texts that give us certain storylines. And they could be myths or symbols that we extract from these narratives that we could then use as moral models, such as the model of Jesus. In his religious work, you also see performative means. Rituals get a lot of his attention in that wonderful book on religion. Kant talks about religions of baptism, communion, or communal prayer. And the kind of point of these things is not to manipulate a deity or to get you goodies in heaven, but instead to get you into a certain way of thinking and judging and acting based upon motives in line with the moral law. And then finally, when it comes to the kind of political discussion we have in our society, many of Kant's works talk about what I would relabel as his critical educative rhetoric. And some of this has to deal with how we talk to others. Call this his critical rhetoric, dealing with the production of messages that are meant to persuade others. And in this kind of area of Kant, you see him wrestling with concerns about how we respect others that we're talking to. You could also think that a necessary extension of this would be, how do we accept our own utterances vis-a-vis asking others to accept them? Or do we use deceptive emotional appeals to push other people's buttons in ways that we would not be similarly affected? All of these are about how we produce messages that are persuasive to others. The second sort of critical educative rhetoric would be what I call rhetorical criticism, dealing with the reception and judgment of messages of others that we receive. And here's some of the key questions would be these. Do we objectify the utterances of others as mere illusions or as the symptoms of ideologies working? Or do we think from their position in arguing with them and considering the truth of what they claim as possibly truths we should adapt and adopt? So, some of these aspects will be speculative, the ideas of ideology, for instance, but some of these are what Kant was talking about when he, in his Anthropology, talked about thinking from our perspective and thinking from the perspective of others. So, in summary, there's much more to the story of Kant and rhetoric. But needless to say, there is a story out there waiting to be told about Kant and rhetoric, as well as about the idea of Kantian rhetoric itself. Now, whether that story leads us, to this spot or that spot, like all things in Kant's system, it will orbit very closely around his particular views on moral worth and the value of freedom. We but need the imagination to get beyond our initial or perhaps received reaction that rhetoric is one thing and it's wholly negative for Kant.